you can say a life without risk is hardly worth having. You know, it might be secure, although it isn't, because as I said, not taking a risk also constitutes a risk. And you know, when you look back, people often are more upset about the things they didn't do, the chances they didn't take, than the failures that they encountered. Now, not always, obviously, it depends on the failure. But, you know, you can sit at home encased in styrofoam and have your meals delivered. And you're probably, you know, you're not going to get mugged, probably. But what's a hell of a life? Psychologists have struggled for a long time to define mental health and pathology. It's really hard because mental illness and even physical illness, it's not simple. It's not, sometimes it is. There's a pathogen or not. Even then it's complicated because you can't tell why the pathogen popped up at that point. But anyways, in mental health, it's even more difficult. So, you know, people have tried to define what constitutes optimal health or optimal performance in a system or a person in a bunch of different ways. You can say, well, deviation from the average is pathological, but we don't think about that with talent or beauty or intelligence. So as a general principle, that can't be right. Some people have said for mental health that a system is unhealthy when it deviates from its evolutionary function. Well, I don't buy that because it's very difficult to specify the evolutionary function of all sorts of things. So that just doesn't solve the problem for me. What seems to happen, as far as I can tell, is that things are useful up to a certain point, and once they dominate, and sort of like the Cyclops image, with the Cyclops only seeing one thing. If you get too single-minded about anything, any virtue, or any behavior for that matter, it hits a point where it starts to turn back on itself, and then you've gone too far. And when it turns back on itself, it hits what's technically called a positive feedback loop, and then the thing spirals out of control catastrophically and unpredictably. And I can give you some examples of that. So let's say you start to get depressed. Okay, and you know, maybe you're slowly getting more and more depressed. Well, there's going to be a tipping point, or there often is a tipping point, where you're so depressed, you quit going to work and you lose your job. Well, that's not so good for your depression, because now you're not only depressed, you're unemployed, and you don't have any money. Well, and then maybe, you know, your wife is getting pretty tired of having to deal with you because you're depressed, and now you also don't have a job, and the stress is too much for her, and so you fight a lot, and that makes you more depressed. And then you start to stay at home because you don't really want to show your face in public, and so you lose all your friends, and man, it's a cliff. So you're doing not too bad, even though it might be a downhill walk, until you hit this, like, single event, and then it just goes whomp. You know, because being unemployed makes you more depressed, and that makes it less likely that you're going to look for a job. And you can, okay, with alcoholism, and other forms of addiction, what seems to happen to me is that you hit the positive feedback loop point when you start using the drug to cure its own withdrawal symptoms. So you're not in trouble with cocaine until you start using it because the cocaine has made you feel bad in the withdrawal. Same with alcohol. You're all shaky and you got the shakes and so on, and you figure out one day, Jesus, shot of vodka, I'm good. Yeah. No. You're firmly in the grip of the devil at that point. And I think a lot of systems are like this. They work fine, but as they get more and more exaggerated, they get closer and closer to a tip-off point, and then the tip-off point is where all hell breaks loose. And virtues are even like that. So we know, for example, that conscientiousness is a trait, and conscientious people are industrious and orderly. So it's like the Protestant work ethic. Okay. We also know that orderliness is grounded in disgust sensitivity. Okay. We know that orderly people, on average, have better hygienic habits, and they live longer. But they're also more inclined to radically disapprove of homosexual behavior. They're also more anti-foreigner, because they have a real tight me, not me discrimination system, and they're disgusted by what's not me. Well, that's good. You don't like dirt. And you can be sure that among our forefathers, it was very frequent, if you were an explorer and you went out to meet a bunch of strangers, you and your whole damn crew were dead 3 weeks later. Because they gave you some disease you have no resistance to whatsoever, and it just wiped you out. I mean, that's what happened to the Native Americans. And it wiped out 95% of them. You know, this is a deadly thing. Anyways, as orderliness increases in its intensity, it starts to shade into like vicious intolerance. So the fascists, for example, the Nazis, were orderly. They didn't like parasites. And they thought of anything that wasn't just like them, their corporate body, the Aryans, was a parasite and it should be eradicated. That's a pretty good idea when you're eradicating parasites. I mean, Hitler tried to get rid of tuberculosis to begin with. But then the question arises, what's a parasite? At some point, it's like everyone who isn't me. And, you know, Hitler got to that point before he died because he felt that the whole German society, he lost faith in the Aryan society as the war was being lost. And he was perfectly happy that the bloody place went up in fire, which is a purifying element. So, you know, even, look, conscientiousness is virtuous. But you take any virtue too far, off the cliff you fall. So there's like this range within which something works. And when you push it past that range, it starts to feed on itself and it turns